I never thought my marriage would unravel in the attic, of all places. It was just another mundane afternoon, sorting through forgotten boxes while sunlight streamed through the dust-covered window. My husband Ethan was downstairs, laughing on a call, probably a work thing. I remember thinking how lucky I was, married to someone so devoted, so dependable. And then I found it. A box tucked behind old suitcases, as if someone had wanted it forgotten. It wasn't labelled, just an ordinary cardboard box, but its weight felt different, heavier. Inside, a stack of passports stared back at me, and my heart stuttered. One by one, I flipped through them. The man in the photos was Ethan, my Ethan. But the names? They weren't his. Michael Summers, David Crane, Jonathan Reed. Each name was paired with his face, but the dates and details didn't add up. I felt my breath quicken, my hands trembling as if the box itself had suddenly grown sharp edges. At first, I laughed, a nervous, hollow laugh. Maybe it was a mistake, a joke. Ethan did have a weird sense of humour sometimes, didn't he? But then why hide them? My mind scrambled for answers, clinging to the idea of an explanation. A reasonable, logical one. This couldn't be what it looked like. Yet, as I stood there, gripping those passports, the weight of their secrets seemed to pull me down. I could hear Ethan's voice downstairs, cheerful and familiar, completely unaware that my world had just tilted on its axis. For a moment, I debated whether to confront him immediately, demand answers. But something, call it instinct or fear, told me to hold off. Instead, I slid the box back into its hiding spot, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he'd hear it. I had to know more before I said anything, because this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It couldn't be. It wasn't always like this, you know. Once, Ethan was my safe haven, my dream, the man who made me believe in love again. I still remember the day we met, clear as if it were yesterday. I'd just come out of a brutal breakup, the kind that leaves you doubting everything about yourself. I was sitting in a tiny cafe, nursing a cold cup of coffee, flipping through my sketchbook more out of habit than inspiration. My designs were lifeless, just like I felt back then. Then, he walked in. Ethan had this effortless confidence about him, the kind that turned heads without trying. He ordered a cappuccino and somehow ended up at my table, smiling like he'd known me forever. "Rough day?" he asked, his voice warm and steady, as if he genuinely cared. I don't know why, but I told him everything, about my ex, my doubts, how I wasn't sure I had it in me to keep designing. Most people would have politely nodded or offered empty platitudes, but not Ethan. He leaned in, listened intently, and then said something I'll never forget. Heartbreak doesn't break you, Sophia, it just bends you into someone stronger. From that day, he was a constant in my life. Our whirlwind romance felt like a fairy tale. Ethan wasn't just charming, he was supportive in ways that felt almost too good to be true. When I doubted my designs, he'd sit with me for hours, giving feedback that was somehow both constructive and encouraging. It was Ethan who convinced me to take the leap and launch my own fashion line. I still remember the way he popped champagne in our tiny apartment the night I landed my first big client, his face glowing with pride. "This is just the beginning," he'd said, pulling me into a hug so tight it felt like nothing could ever go wrong. Back then, I thought I'd found the one. The man who'd never let me down. And yet, standing in that attic with those passports, I couldn't help but wonder, was any of it real? I couldn't stay away from that box for long. After Ethan left for work the next morning, I found myself climbing back into the attic. My mind had been racing all night, replaying every little thing I knew about him, every late night, every business trip. I'd convinced myself I needed to see it all again, to be sure I hadn't overreacted. The box was exactly where I'd left it, tucked behind the old suitcases. This time, my hands didn't tremble as much. I needed answers. I opened the lid again, pulling out the passports, 3 of them to be exact, with Ethan's face but names I didn't recognise. Michael Summers, David Crane, Jonathan Reed. Each had different birth dates, occupations, and even different countries of residence. Who was this man? Then beneath the passports I found a photograph. My chest tightened as I held it up to the light. Ethan was standing with another woman, his arm casually draped around her shoulders. She was beautiful, tall, blonde, and laughing like she didn't have a care in the world. It wasn't a friendly photo. No, this was intimate. My mind scrambled to place her face, but she was a stranger. I almost stopped there, overwhelmed by the tidal wave of emotions flooding my chest. Anger, hurt, confusion. But something else caught my eye, a folded piece of paper tucked into the corner of the box. It was a letter, written in Ethan's familiar handwriting. It started innocently enough. "Thomas, I hope this reaches you safely. Things are becoming more complicated than I expected. I may need to disappear for a while. Keep everything ready on your end. Thomas." That name stuck in my mind like a thorn. Who was he, and why was Ethan writing to him about disappearing? My heart raced as I reread the letter, searching for any clues that might explain it away, but none came. As I pieced through the box, my world began to tilt in ways I couldn't control. Those late-night phone calls Ethan brushed off as work, the trips he swore were essential business, they suddenly didn't seem so innocent. My mind was a mess of fragmented memories. The time he came home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. The cryptic text messages I'd caught glimpses of over his shoulder. The constant excuses for why he couldn't join me at family dinners anymore. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that my Ethan, the man who'd swept me off my feet, who'd promised me forever, was hiding something far darker than I could have imagined. I didn't plan to confront Ethan that night, not yet. But the weight of what I'd found was too much to carry alone. Every time I looked at him, all I could see were those passports, that woman in the photo, the letter. My mind wouldn't stop spinning, no matter how much I told myself to wait. When he walked through the door that evening, he was the same Ethan I'd always known, smiling, casual, dropping his keys on the counter. "Long day," he sighed, kissing my forehead like nothing was amiss. But now even that small gesture felt hollow, rehearsed. I tried to act normal, but my voice betrayed me. "Everything okay at work?" I asked, watching him too closely. He looked at me for a second too long before answering. "Yeah, same old." I nodded, forcing a smile, but the unease in my stomach refused to settle. After dinner, Ethan retreated to his office as he often did, leaving me alone with my thoughts. But tonight, something felt different. The walls seemed to close in as I replayed his every word, his every move. Curiosity, or maybe desperation, got the better of me. I crept down the hall toward his office, intending only to peek in, to reassure myself that I was imagining things. But as I neared the door, his voice stopped me cold. It wasn't just what he was saying, it was how he was saying it. His tone was sharp, authoritative, nothing like the warm, steady voice I knew. And the language, it wasn't English. It was something else entirely, something foreign and unrecognizable, spoken fluently and urgently. I leaned closer, my heart pounding in my ears. "It's under control," I heard him say as he switched back to English, his tone clipped and firm. "I told you I'll handle it. Just stick to the plan." The plan. My blood ran cold. I felt like a trespasser in my own life, eavesdropping on a man I no longer recognized. Before I could think, the door creaked under my weight. His voice cut off immediately. I froze, and a moment later the door swung open. Ethan stood there, his face unreadable. "Sophia," he said, his voice smooth again, like he hadn't just been barking orders in a language I couldn't place. "What are you doing?" I thought I heard something," I stammered, cursing the quiver in my voice. His eyes narrowed, just for a moment before he softened, smiling that same disarming smile that once made me fall for him. "Just work stuff," he said casually, stepping past me. "You know how it is." I wanted to push, to ask him about the call, the language, but the way he brushed me off, the way he moved so effortlessly back into husband mode, left me stunned. "Nothing to worry about," he added, placing a hand on my shoulder as he passed. But everything in me screamed otherwise. As I stood there in the dim hallway, I realized I couldn't ask him yet. Not about the call, not about the box, because I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answers. Not yet. That night, as I lay in bed next to him, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the warmth of his body beside me. And yet, for the first time in our marriage, I'd never felt so alone. By the next morning, I was done waiting for answers to come to me. Ethan's easy lies and the secrets he buried weren't going to reveal themselves. If I wanted the truth, I had to go find it. While Ethan showered, I slipped into his office. My pulse hammered as I searched his drawers and rifled through his desk. I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong, that this was my life too, but the guilt gnawed at me anyway. Still, I found nothing but neatly organized papers and files, all carefully curated. Too carefully. I realized the answers weren't here. They were in the box. So, as soon as Ethan left for work, I climbed back into the attic. Armed with the passports, the letter and the photograph, I started my search. The passports were my first lead. I couldn't make sense of the names at first, but I plugged them into every online search engine I could think of. One name stood out: Michael Summers. There were vague, fragmented reports, accusations of embezzlement at a company overseas, investigations that had mysteriously disappeared, and rumors of connections to organized crime. My Ethan wasn't just hiding a past, he was running from it. Next, I turned my attention to the photo. The woman. Her face haunted me, and I couldn't stop imagining her life with Ethan, or whoever he was to her. With a reverse image search, I finally got a hit. Her name was Margaret Dawson, and she'd once been married to a man named Jonathan Reed, another one of Ethan's aliases. My hands shook as I stared at her social media profile. Barely active, but enough to confirm the truth. She was no stranger. She had shared a life with him before me, a life he'd left behind without a trace, just like the one he seemed to be building with me. I debated for hours, but I couldn't resist. I sent her a message, a cautious, almost apologetic plea for information. I expected silence or anger, but to my surprise, she replied almost immediately. Her response chilled me. Margaret confirmed what I feared, that she too had fallen for Ethan's charm, his seemingly perfect facade. They had been married for 4 years, and she described the same whirlwind romance, the same sweet promises, but things had unraveled quickly when she discovered his web of lies. He's dangerous, she warned me. He isn't who you think he is. She wouldn't go into detail over messages, but she insisted we meet. My instincts told me to stay far away, but curiosity, no, desperation got the better of me. I needed to hear everything. As I stared at Margaret's final message, arranging a meeting place, I felt my world shift again. Ethan had carefully crafted his life with me, but now I was beginning to see the cracks. What terrified me most was how expertly he had hidden them, and what else he might be capable of hiding. I spent the rest of the day rehearsing what I would say. Confronting Ethan wasn't just about demanding answers. It was about tearing down the life we had built, brick by carefully placed brick. But after what Margaret told me, I couldn't wait any longer. When Ethan walked through the door that night, I was already sitting in the living room, the box on the coffee table between us. My heart raced as he looked at me, then at the box, his smile faltering for the first time. "What's this?" he asked, his voice steady but his eyes wary. I didn't answer right away. I simply opened the box and laid the contents bare. The passports, the photo, the letter. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, ready to snap. "Explain this to me," I said, my voice shaking but firm. For a moment, Ethan said nothing. He looked down at the items, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Finally, he exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to drain the room of air. "I was hoping you'd never find this," he said softly. "That's it? That's all you're going to say?" I demanded, my voice rising with anger and desperation. "Who are you, Ethan? Or should I call you Michael? Or Jonathan? Who is Margaret? And why the hell do you have 3 passports?" He met my eyes, and for the first time I saw something I'd never seen in him before. Fear. "Sophia," he began, his voice low and controlled. "You need to stop digging, for your own sake." "Stop digging?" I shot back. "I'm your wife. You've lied to me about everything. I deserve the truth." He hesitated, then sat across from me, his face hard but his voice trembling just slightly. "You're right. I owe you the truth, but you're not going to like it." I braced myself as he began. He told me his real name, Thomas Grant, and the life he had left behind. A life tangled in betrayal, deception, and danger. Years ago, he had worked for a powerful corporation involved in things that went far beyond the law. When he discovered how deep the corruption ran, he tried to expose them. But instead of justice, he found himself a marked man. "They don't forgive, Sophia," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "and they don't forget." He explained how he'd been forced to disappear, to erase every trace of the man he once was. The aliases, the constant moving, the endless lies. It was all to stay alive. "And then I met you," he said, his voice softening. "You were my escape, my chance at something real. I didn't tell you because I didn't want this life to touch you." I wanted to believe him, but the weight of his words crushed me. "So all of this," I whispered, gesturing to the room around us, "it's a lie?" "No," he said firmly, "my love for you isn't a lie. That's the only real thing I have left." For a fleeting moment, I saw the man I thought I knew, the man who held me when I cried, who whispered promises in the dark. But then his voice hardened again. "But if you keep digging, Sophia, if you keep pulling at these threads, you'll unravel everything, and it won't just be me who pays the price." I stared at him, my mind racing with questions, with doubts, with anger. But one thought drowned out all the others. What kind of man had I married? Ethan's confession lingered in the air like smoke, thick, choking, impossible to ignore. I wanted to believe him, to hold on to the idea that the man I loved was still in there somewhere. But doubt gnawed at me, relentless and sharp. In the days that followed, things began to change. Ethan wasn't the same. He was more attentive than ever, but it felt calculated. He'd reach for my hand at random moments, his grip firm, almost possessive. He'd linger near me when I was on my phone or working on my designs, his eyes darting to the screen as if searching for something. Then came the moment that shattered any illusion of trust I had left. I picked up my phone one evening to find it wouldn't unlock with my usual passcode. Confused, I tried again, then again, until a sick realization washed over me. Someone had changed it. My stomach dropped as I turned to Ethan, who was sitting across the room, scrolling on his laptop. "Did you mess with my phone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't look up, but I saw his fingers pause on the keyboard for just a second too long. "You must have forgotten your password," he said, his tone light, but his eyes giving nothing away. It was a small thing, a tiny slip in the facade, but it confirmed what I'd feared. Ethan was watching me, controlling me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every shadow that passed under the door felt like a threat. I was no longer just suspicious. I was afraid. Afraid of the man who shared my bed, of the secrets he carried, of what he might do to keep them buried. The breaking point came when I found a GPS tracker tucked under the driver's seat of my car. My heart pounded as I held it in my hand, my mind racing. This wasn't love, this wasn't protection, this was control, plain and simple. I realized then that I wasn't just dealing with a man who had lied to me. I was dealing with a man who would go to any lengths to keep his lies intact, even if it meant turning his watchful eye on me. I knew I had to make a choice, confront him again and risk everything, or quietly find a way out before it was too late. Either way, my world was no longer safe. The man I once loved had become the man I feared the most. I knew I couldn't stay in this house any longer. The walls, once comforting, now felt like a cage closing in on me. But the thought of Ethan discovering my plan, of him realizing that I was about to slip away, made every breath feel like it might betray me. I had to be careful. I played my part, acting like nothing had changed. I smiled when he walked into the room, kissed him on the cheek like I used to. I nodded when he asked about my day, giving him just enough to keep him content. Every movement, every word was calculated. It was exhausting, but it was the only way. I spent hours packing, carefully, methodically. I couldn't take everything. I didn't have the luxury of waiting until I was ready. I had to be swift, like a ghost in the night. Clothes, cash, some important documents. I made sure to leave the bare minimum behind so Ethan wouldn't notice. Everything had to seem normal, just in case he was watching. When I was done, I stood in front of the mirror, my reflection staring back at me, a stranger in her own life. For a moment, I almost felt like I was looking at someone else, someone brave, someone who knew that leaving was the only way to survive. It was dark outside when I finally slipped out of the house. The moon hung low, casting shadows that seemed to follow me as I crept toward the garage. My heart hammered in my chest, each thump louder than the last, as if it was screaming, telling me to turn back, to stay, to pretend none of this was happening, but I couldn't, not anymore. I had a plan, a route, a safe place. But even as I drove away, the weight of what I was doing settled in. Would he notice? Would he find out before I could escape? I glanced at the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see headlights behind me, but the street was empty, quiet, like the calm before the storm. But my mind wouldn't stop. thoughts of Ethan's eyes, his words, his hands hovering a little too close, a little too protective, it all rushed back. Could he really have been that man I loved? Or was he always the man who kept secrets, who manipulated, who controlled? As I turned onto the main road, I let out a breath I hadn't realised I was holding. I was leaving the only life I had known for the unknown, for safety, for a chance to reclaim myself. The hardest part wasn't getting out, it was walking away from the person I had once believed in. The road stretched ahead, endless and full of possibilities. But as the lights of our home faded in the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan might not let me go so easily. The silence in the car was deafening as I drove further away from the life I once knew. The headlights sliced through the night, cutting through the fog of uncertainty that clouded my thoughts. I tried not to think about what I was leaving behind, my home, my dreams, my marriage. It felt like a part of me was being ripped away, but the other part, the part that had been quietly suffocating, was relieved. I didn't know what I was heading toward. I didn't know where I would go exactly or how long I could hide. But I knew one thing. I couldn't stay there with him. Not after everything I had uncovered. Not after seeing the man I loved turn into someone I didn't even recognize. But as I turned onto the highway, my phone buzzed, shattering the stillness. It was a text from Ethan. "Where are you?" My heart skipped a beat. I had barely left and already he was reaching out. His words were calm, too calm. A sharp pang of dread sank deep into my chest. I didn't reply right away. I couldn't. If I answered too soon, he'd know something was off. But then came another text, more frantic this time. "Sophia, what's going on? Why are you acting so distant? Talk to me." I clenched the steering wheel. The urge to tell him everything, to confess my fear, my anger, my betrayal, was so strong I almost gave in. But I couldn't. Not like this. Not over a text. I quickly typed back a vague response, something that wouldn't make him suspicious, something that wouldn't expose the fragile plan I was clinging to. "Just needed some space, I'll be home soon." I hit send, then tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I had to focus. I couldn't let him pull me back in with his lies and his charm. But then my phone buzzed again. I glanced at it, my stomach sinking. It was a call from Ethan. I let it ring out, my breath hitching. The silence that followed felt like a heavy weight pressing on my chest. What if he was already onto me? What if he was tracking my movements, monitoring everything? I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts swirling inside my mind. I couldn't go back. I couldn't let him manipulate me again. I pressed the gas pedal a little harder, pushing the car faster into the night. I had no idea what the future held, but I couldn't stop now. A few miles later, I pulled off the highway and into a secluded motel parking lot. The neon sign flickered above me, casting a cold light onto the empty road. I parked in the farthest corner, far from the main entrance, and took a moment to gather myself. For the first time in days, my mind was still. There was no noise, no chaos, just the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, glancing around as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows, but it was quiet. Too quiet. I stepped out of the car, locking it behind me, and walked to the front desk. The clerk barely looked up from his screen as I checked in, and for a moment, I felt like I was disappearing. This was real. I was really doing it. As I made my way to the room, the weight of my decisions settled heavily on my shoulders. I was alone now. I had no one to turn to, no one to trust, except myself. I entered the room, the dull glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The bed was untouched, the silence thick and oppressive. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. I knew Ethan. He would come looking for me. He wouldn't just let me walk away without a fight. But I also knew something he didn't. I wasn't the woman I used to be. The woman who stayed silent, who ignored the warning signs, who put up with betrayal. I was done being scared, done being the woman who ignored her instincts. I took a deep breath, then reached for the phone and called the one person I knew could help. The line rang, once, twice, before someone picked up. "Sophia?" Her voice was familiar, warm, comforting. It felt like the first real connection I had in days. "I need help," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I don't know how much time I have. He's going to come after me. I need to get out for good." The words tumbled out in a rush, everything I had been holding in finally breaking free. "You're not alone," she said, her voice steady and filled with resolve. "I'll help you. You just need to stay strong." I closed my eyes for a moment, the relief almost too much to bear. Maybe I hadn't completely lost myself in all of this. Maybe there was still hope. But deep down, I knew one thing for certain. The hardest part was still ahead of me. Getting away from Ethan was only the beginning. I moved into another town to stay far away from Ethan and start afresh. Then one morning, coming back from my usual morning stroll, I saw something hanging on my doorknob. It was an envelope. My heart skipped a beat, then pounded like a drum in my chest. I knew, even before I touched it, who it was from. The handwriting was unmistakable, even though it had been years since I last saw it. Ethan's. I stood frozen in the hallway for what felt like forever, staring at the envelope in my hands. I thought I was safe. I thought I had left it all behind when I moved to this small town. I'd rebuilt my life, put the pieces back together, convinced myself I was free. But now, in the quiet of my little apartment, I felt the walls closing in again. With trembling fingers, I tore open the envelope. I had to know. The letter was short, almost too short to convey everything I was feeling. But those few words, they hit me like a slap across the face. The paper felt cold in my hands as I read the words, my eyes scanning them over and over, hoping I had misread it somehow. But no, it was exactly what I thought. "You'll always be mine. You can run, but you'll never be free. I know where you are. I'll be coming for you soon." I dropped the letter, my body feeling like it was suddenly too heavy for the ground beneath me. The room seemed to spin as the blood drained from my face. Was I really reading this? Was this really happening? I had told myself I was done, that I was safe. But in that moment, I realized that no matter how far I ran, no matter where I hid, Ethan would always find a way back. I couldn't escape him. Not fully. I felt a wave of panic crash over me. My hands were shaking, and I could barely hold my breath. But then something shifted. The panic turned into something else, something colder, sharper, anger. I had escaped once. I had survived him once, and I would do it again. I spent the rest of the day locked in a whirlwind of preparation and paranoia. Every creak of the floorboards, every passing shadow outside my window sent shivers crawling up my spine. My mind raced with scenarios, each one worse than the last. Would Ethan come alone? Would he try to manipulate me again with sweet lies? Or had he already slipped into something darker, more dangerous? I couldn't afford to wait and find out. The first thing I did was pack a small bag, essentials only. Clothes, cash I had stashed away, my passport, and the burner phone I had bought shortly after I arrived in town. My new life, so carefully built, felt like it was slipping through my fingers. But I had to stay focused. This wasn't about comfort. It was about survival. I debated calling the police, but what could I say? That my estranged husband, who I had no proof was even nearby, might be coming after me? They'd need more than a threatening letter to act, and Ethan was smart. He'd cover his tracks, just like he always did. Instead, I called the one person I could trust, Maria. She was the only friend I had made since moving here, and even though I had kept the details of my past vague, she had always been supportive. When she picked up, her voice was warm and familiar, but the words spilled out of me before she could say much. "I need your help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's Ethan. He found me." Maria didn't hesitate. "Where are you? Are you safe?" "For now, but I don't know for how long," I admitted, pacing the room. "I'm leaving town tonight, but I need someone to keep an eye out, just in case." Maria agreed without question. She promised to check in on my apartment and call me if anything seemed off. It wasn't much, but it gave me a sliver of reassurance. By the time I hung up, the sky had turned pitch black. The quiet streets outside seemed eerily still, like the calm before a storm. I zipped up my bag and slipped out of the apartment, my heart pounding with every step. The bus station was a few blocks away. It felt like miles. Every time a car passed, I held my breath, imagining Ethan's face behind the wheel. But the journey was uneventful, and soon I was seated on a bus heading to a neighboring city. It wasn't far enough to make me feel safe, but it was a start. The hours dragged as the bus rumbled down the road. I stared out the window, the countryside rolling past like a dark blur. I thought about the life I had left behind again. How many more times would I have to do this? How many more nights would I spend looking over my shoulder, wondering if Ethan was in the shadows? I had just started to relax when my phone buzzed. It was Maria. "I stopped by your place," she said, her voice low and tense. "There was a man parked outside in a black car. He didn't get out, but he was watching your window." My stomach dropped. I gripped the phone tighter, my breath catching in my throat. "Did he see you?" "I don't think so," Maria said quickly, "but he wasn't there when I drove past earlier. Be careful, Sophia." I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. He was closer than I thought. Too close. When the bus finally pulled into the station, I forced myself to keep calm. I blended in with the crowd, slipping through the exit unnoticed. The night air was cool, but I was sweating. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, even though I knew it was just my paranoia. Or was it? I didn't stop moving until I reached a small motel on the outskirts of town. It was nothing like the cozy apartment I had left behind, but it would have to do. The clerk didn't ask any questions as I paid in cash and took the key to my room. Once inside, I bolted the door and collapsed onto the bed. Exhaustion washed over me, but sleep was out of the question. I sat there in the dim light, the letter from Ethan replaying in my mind. "You'll always be mine." His words weren't just a threat, they were a promise. And I knew Ethan well enough to know that he never made promises he didn't intend to keep. But if he thought he could break me again, he was wrong. I had survived too much, fought too hard, to let him win. Whatever came next, I'd face it head on, and this time, I wouldn't run. I didn't know how this would end, but one thing was certain. Ethan and I were far from finished.